The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Colorado Territory, 1873, as Lillian Vaughn sprinted through the tall grass, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild Mustang. Freedom was just beyond the horizon, but the men her father had sent were closing in fast. She hadn't planned on stealing a horse when she fled, but desperation made thieves of even the most honest souls. The wedding dress she'd abandoned back at her father's ranch seemed a lifetime away now, along with the wealthy mine owner who'd purchased her hand like another business transaction. When her stolen mare stumbled in a prairie dog hole, Lillian tumbled forward, her body hitting the hard earth with a painful thud. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder as she scrambled to her feet. The mare had already bolted, leaving her stranded in the open grassland with nowhere to hide. Another shot rang out, this one closer, kicking up dirt just feet from where she stood. "That's far enough, Miss Vaughn," a gruff voice called out. "Your father's offering good money to bring you back." Lillian spun around, her copper hair whipping across her face as she stared down 3 riders approaching at a gallop. In that moment, a 4th rider appeared from a copse of trees to her right, moving like a shadow across the landscape. Unlike the others, this stranger rode directly toward her pursuers, not toward her. "Get down!" the newcomer shouted, his voice carrying across the wind. Lillian dropped to the ground as more gunfire erupted. When she dared to look up, 2 of her pursuers were retreating, and a 3rd lay motionless on the ground. The mysterious rider approached slowly, his face obscured by the setting sun behind him. All she could make out was his tall frame and the distinctive silhouette of a cowboy hat. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat as he dismounted, "seems you found yourself in quite a predicament." Lillian got to her feet, brushing dirt from her riding clothes. "I appreciate the assistance, but I didn't ask for your help." "No, you didn't," he replied, a hint of amusement in his voice. But those men didn't seem interested in asking permission either. As he stepped closer, Lillian could finally see his face's strong jawline covered in a few days' worth of stubble, eyes as blue as the mountain lakes, and a small scar running along his left cheekbone. "Keaton Jones," he said, extending a calloused hand. "And you are leaving," Lillian replied, ignoring his hand. "Thank you for your intervention, Mr. Jones, but I need to keep moving. Without a horse," he gestured to the open prairie, "those men will be back with reinforcements." "Your father must want you returned quite badly." Lillian stiffened. "How do you know about my father?" Those men weren't exactly quiet about their business. Something about a runaway bride and a very displeased mine owner waiting at an altar. Keaton whistled, and his horse approached. "I'm heading to Willow Creek. You're welcome to ride with me, at least until you figure out your next move." Lillian eyed him suspiciously. "And what's to stop you from collecting the reward yourself?" "Madam, if I wanted money, I'd have let them take you and then robbed them on their way back to town." His smile revealed a slight dimple in his right cheek. Much easier than fighting 3 armed men. Despite her reservations, Lillian knew she had few options. The sun was setting, the temperature would drop soon, and being alone on the prairie at night was a death sentence of its own. "Fine," she conceded, "but just to Willow Creek, then we part ways." "Whatever you say, Miss Vaughn, Lillian Vaughn." Keaton helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her. "Well, Miss Vaughn, it seems we've got ourselves a journey ahead." As they rode toward the setting sun, Lillian felt the strange comfort of this stranger's presence, a man who had risked his life for hers without knowing her name. What she didn't know then was how their paths would remain intertwined through the dangerous days ahead, and how this chance encounter would change everything she believed about her future. The ride to Willow Creek was mostly silent. Lillian sat rigidly in front of Keaton, trying to maintain as much distance as possible between her back and his chest, though the motion of the horse made this nearly impossible. Each time she inadvertently leaned against him, she quickly straightened, earning a soft chuckle from her rescuer. "You know," Keaton finally said as they crested a hill overlooking a small valley, "most folks I rescue are a bit more talkative. You make a habit of rescuing strangers, Mr. Jones." "Not particularly, but when I see someone in need, I tend not to ride the other way." He adjusted his grip on the reins, his arm briefly brushing against her waist. "Mind telling me why a woman like you is running from her own wedding?" Lillian stared straight ahead. "A woman like me? Well-bred, educated, your speech gives you away. Not many women out here speak so precisely." "Perhaps that's precisely why I'm running," she replied. "I have no desire to be anyone's possession, Mr. Jones. My father arranged my marriage to Gregory Hollister without my consent. Hollister is twice my age and sees me as nothing more than a decorative addition to his household." Keaton nodded thoughtfully. "And where were you planning to go? These territories aren't exactly forgiving to a woman alone. I have an aunt in San Francisco. She wrote to me years ago offering a place should I ever need it. I saved enough from teaching at the local school to make the journey." Lillian sighed. "At least, I had until my father discovered my plans and confiscated my savings." The horse slowed as they approached a creek. Keaton dismounted first, then offered his hand to help Lillian down. She hesitated before accepting his assistance, her fingers lingering in his palm for just a moment too long. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, leading the horse to water. "Willow Creek's still a few hours' ride. We'll arrive after nightfall." Lillian knelt by the water, splashing some on her face and neck. The cool relief was immediate, washing away some of the dust and anxiety of the day. When she looked up, she caught Keaton watching her, his expression unreadable. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Just trying to figure you out, Miss Vaughn. Most women would be grateful for a match with someone like Hollister. He's wealthy, established. Most women haven't seen what a loveless marriage does to the soul," Lillian replied sharply. "My mother withered away under my father's control. I watched her disappear a little more each day until there was nothing left but an empty shell performing wifely duties." She stood, brushing dirt from her riding skirt. "I decided long ago that would never be me." Keaton nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But what's your plan once you reach San Francisco? Surely your father will look for you there." "I'll find work as a teacher again. Change my name if necessary." Lillian's voice carried more confidence than she felt. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Jones. I believe that." He handed her a canteen. "Drink. The air gets drier as we head west." As Lillian drank, she studied her mysterious rescuer more carefully. His clothes were worn but clean, his gun belt well maintained. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to handling himself in difficult situations. "What about you?" she asked, returning the canteen. "What brings you to these parts?" "Just passing through," he replied vaguely. "I do odd jobs here and there. Been working as a ranch hand for the Harrigan spread north of here, but the season's ending." "You're a drifter." "I prefer man of opportunity," Keaton said with a small smile. "The West is full of possibilities for those willing to work and adapt." Before Lillian could respond, Keaton suddenly tensed, his hand moving to his holster. He nodded toward a ridge about half a mile back. "We've got company," he said quietly. "Could be your father's men, could be bandits. Either way, we should move." Lillian felt her heart rate quicken as she spotted the distant riders. "There are at least 5 of them." "6, Keaton corrected, already leading his horse away from the creek. "And they're moving fast. Come on." He helped her mount quickly before swinging up behind her. Instead of continuing on the trail, he guided the horse into a dense grove of cottonwoods that followed the creek. Won't they just follow our tracks? Lillian asked as branches whipped past them. Not if we use the creek to our advantage. Keaton directed the horse into the shallow water where it splashed downstream. Water doesn't hold tracks. We'll follow this for a mile or so, then cut across country. With luck, they'll continue on the main trail. As they rode through the water, Lillian found herself impressed by Keaton's woodcraft. He clearly knew these lands well, navigating with confidence even as daylight began to fade. After a while, he guided them out of the creek and across a rocky outcropping that would leave minimal tracks. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles from here," he said close to her ear. "Not much, but it'll give us shelter for the night. We can reach Willow Creek by midday tomorrow." "I thought we'd make it tonight," Lillian said, unable to hide her disappointment. "That was before we had to take this detour. Unless you fancy riding all night and risking the horse breaking a leg in some unseen hole," Lillian sighed. "No, of course not." The cabin, when they finally reached it as night fell completely, was indeed not much a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with one chair, and a narrow cot pushed against the far wall. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs decorated the corners like lace curtains. "It's not the Grand Hotel," Keaton said as he lit a lantern he'd found on a shelf, "but it's better than sleeping under the stars with those men still looking for you." Lillian stood awkwardly in the center of the room, suddenly very aware of their isolation and proximity. "I appreciate all you've done, Mr. Jones, but this arrangement is hardly proper." Keaton laughed as he began gathering wood for the fireplace. "Miss Vaughn, I think propriety left the conversation the moment you stole a horse and fled your wedding. But if it eases your mind, I'll sleep outside with my bedroll. The night's mild enough." Lillian felt a flush of embarrassment at his words. "That won't be necessary. I didn't mean to imply, no offense taken," he interrupted, kneeling to start the fire. "I understand your caution. You've no reason to trust me." As the flames caught and began to spread warmth through the cabin, Lillian found herself studying Keaton's profile. There was something in the set of his jaw, the careful way he tended the fire, that spoke of a man with his own stories to tell. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. "The truth, please." Keaton was silent for a long moment, still facing the fire. When he finally turned to her, his expression was solemn. "My sister," he said simply. "She was forced into a marriage much like the one you're running from. She didn't have the courage to flee." He stood, brushing his hands on his pants. 6 months later, she took her own life. Lillian's hand flew to her mouth. "I'm so sorry. It was 5 years ago." Keaton moved to his saddlebag and pulled out some jerky and hardtack. "When I saw you running across that field, determined despite the odds, I couldn't ride away. Couldn't let what happened to Adelaide happen to someone else if I could prevent it." He offered her some of the simple fare, which Lillian accepted gratefully. They ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire and occasional distant howl of a coyote the only sounds. "You should take the cot," Keaton said finally, spreading his bedroll on the floor near the fire. "Get some rest. We'll leave at first light." Lillian nodded, suddenly exhausted from the day's events. As she settled onto the cot, she watched Keaton check his pistol before placing it within easy reach. "Mr. Jones." "Keaton," he corrected. "After sharing a cabin and a horse, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Keaton," she said, testing the name on her tongue. "Thank you, not just for the rescue, but for understanding why I had to run." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Lillian felt something shift in the space between them. "Some things are worth running from, Miss Vaughn. And some things," he added quietly, "might just be worth running toward." With that cryptic statement, he tipped his hat over his eyes and settled back on his bedroll. Lillian lay awake for some time. pondering his words and wondering what kind of man Keaton Jones truly was, and why the thought of parting ways in Willow Creek suddenly filled her with an inexplicable sense of loss. Dawn broke with a gentle palette of pinks and golds as Lillian stirred from the most restful sleep she'd had in weeks. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind, the unfamiliar scent of pine and wood smoke, the rough texture of the blanket beneath her fingers. Then yesterday's events came rushing back, and she sat up quickly, eyes scanning the small cabin. Keaton was already awake, silhouetted against the open doorway as he watched the sunrise. His hat rested on the table beside a steaming cup, and the scent of coffee filled the room. When he heard her movement, he turned. "Morning," he said simply. "Coffee's hot if you want some. Not as fine as you might be used to, but it'll wake you." Lillian smoothed her hair and accepted the tin cup he offered. The coffee was indeed strong and bitter, but the warmth was welcome in the crisp morning air. "I checked the surroundings at first light," Keaton continued, moving back to the doorway. "No sign of pursuit, but that doesn't mean they've given up. We should reach Willow Creek by midday if we make good time." "And then?" Lillian asked, surprising herself with the question. Keaton glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. "And then you continue to San Francisco as planned, I imagine." "Yes, of course," she replied quickly, looking down into her cup. "I just meant what will you do?" he shrugged, leaning against the doorframe. "Haven't decided. Might head north to Montana Territory. Heard they're looking for ranch hands up that way." An uncomfortable silence settled between them as they finished their coffee. Lillian found herself stealing glances at Keaton, noticing things she'd been too frightened or preoccupied to see before, the way sunlight caught in his hair, revealing strands of gold among the brown, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled, the gentle way he handled even simple tasks like rolling up his bedding. "We should get moving," he finally said, breaking the silence. "The stagecoach to Denver leaves Willow Creek this afternoon. From there, you can catch the westbound train." Lillian nodded, gathering her few belongings. As they prepared to leave, she noticed Keaton staring out the doorway again, his posture suddenly tense. "What is it?" she asked, moving to his side. "Smoke," he said, pointing to a thin dark line rising against the blue sky several miles distant. "Too much for a campfire, too controlled for a wildfire." "Could it be a homestead?" "Could be," he agreed, but his tone suggested he thought otherwise. "Let's ride. Stay alert." They mounted quickly, Lillian once again seated in front of Keaton. As they rode toward Willow Creek, following a narrow game trail through rolling hills, Lillian found herself more aware than ever of his proximity, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the occasional brush of his chest against her back when the horse navigated uneven terrain. What had felt uncomfortable yesterday now seemed almost comforting. "Can I ask you something personal?" she ventured after they'd ridden in silence for nearly an hour. "Depends on the question," he replied, his voice rumbling near her ear. "You mentioned your sister, but what about the rest of your family? You have one somewhere." Keaton was quiet for so long that Lillian thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, as if carefully choosing each word. "My parents died in '59. Cholera took them both within days of each other. Adelaide and I went to live with our uncle in St. Louis after that. He wasn't a kind man." Keaton adjusted his grip on the reins. "When I turned 18, I headed west. Tried to convince Adelaide to come with me, but she was engaged by then. Said a difficult future with a known quantity was better than uncertainty with none. And after she died, I kept moving. Never stayed in one place long enough to put down roots. Seemed easier that way." Lillian considered his words. "Doesn't it get lonely?" "Sometimes," he admitted. But loneliness is preferable to watching someone you care about suffer and being powerless to stop it. His words resonated deeply with Lillian, echoing her own thoughts about her mother's slow decline. I understand that feeling all too well. They crested a hill, and Keaton suddenly pulled the horse to a stop. Below them, about a mile distant, the road to Willow Creek stretched like a pale ribbon through the landscape. On that road, a stagecoach lay on its side, one wheel spinning lazily in the air. Bodies were scattered on the ground around it, and several men on horseback were picking through luggage strewn across the dirt. "Bandits," Keaton said grimly, immediately guiding their horse behind the cover of a large boulder. "They've hit the morning stage." Lillian's heart pounded as she took in the scene. "Those poor people. Shouldn't we help?" "Anyone still alive down there won't be for long," Keaton replied, his voice hard. "There are at least 8 of them, and they don't leave witnesses. You know them?" Lillian asked, hearing something personal in his tone. Keaton's jaw tightened. "The Blackwater Gang. They've been terrorizing this territory for months. Army can't catch them, and local lawmen are either too scared or too bought to do anything." He studied the scene below, then glanced at the sun's position. "We'll have to detour around. Adds a few hours to our journey, but better than running into that lot." As they began to back away, a gust of wind carried the sound of a child's cry up the hill. Keaton froze, and Lillian felt him tense behind her. "There's a child down there," she whispered, horrified. Without hesitation, Keaton dismounted and helped Lillian down. "Stay here with the horse," he instructed, checking his pistol. "If I'm not back in 20 minutes, or if they start heading this way, ride east along this ridgeline until you hit a creek, then follow it north. You'll reach the McCready Ranch eventually. They're good people." "You can't be serious," Lillian protested. "There are too many of them." "I can't leave a child to those men," Keaton said firmly. "You know what they'll do." Lillian did know, and the thought made her ill. "Then I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not. I can shoot," she insisted. When he looked skeptical, she added, "My father believed every woman should know how to defend her home. It was the one useful thing he taught me." Keaton studied her for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Stay behind me, do exactly as I say, and if things go wrong, you run. Don't look back, don't hesitate. Promise me." "I promise," Lillian said, though they both knew it might be a lie. Keaton reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a second, smaller pistol, checking it before handing it to her. "6 shots, make them count." They secured the horse and moved carefully down the hillside, using rocks and scrub brush for cover. As they got closer, the scene became clearer and more horrific. The stagecoach driver hung lifelessly from the overturned vehicle, and 2 passengers lay motionless in the dirt. The bandits were laughing as they rifled through trunks and bags. "There," Keaton whispered, pointing to a slight movement beneath the stagecoach. A small form was huddled in the shadow of the overturned vehicle, trying to remain invisible to the men. They crept closer, staying low. When they were about 50 yards away, Keaton motioned for Lillian to stay put behind a large rock. He pointed to 2 bandits who were slightly separated from the main group, then to himself, indicating his plan to take them out quietly. Lillian nodded, heart hammering as she watched Keaton slip away, moving with surprising stealth for a man his size. She kept her eyes on the child under the stagecoach, willing the little one to remain still and silent. Time seemed to stretch as she waited, her palms sweating around the grip of the pistol. Then suddenly, everything happened at once. A shout went up from one of the bandits. They'd spotted the child. At the same instant, 2 quick shots rang out and the 2 men Keaton had targeted dropped. The remaining bandits scattered for cover, guns drawn. Keaton appeared from behind an outcropping, firing with deadly accuracy. 2 more went down before the others realized what was happening. The child, Keaton shouted to Lillian. "Get the child." Without thinking, Lillian broke cover and ran toward the stagecoach as bullets kicked up dust around her. She slid the last few feet, reaching the shadows beneath the coach where a little girl of about 5 cowered, eyes wide with terror. "It's all right," Lillian said, extending her hand. "I'm here to help you." The child hesitated, then grabbed Lillian's hand. As Lillian pulled her out, a bullet splintered wood inches from her head. She turned to see a bandit taking aim for a second shot. Without hesitation, she raised her pistol and fired. The man jerked backward, clutching his shoulder, but remained standing. Before he could recover, another shot rang out and he collapsed. Keaton appeared beside Lillian, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward a nearby ravine, the child clinging to her skirts. "Run," he commanded, firing behind them to cover their retreat. They scrambled down into the ravine as bullets whistled overhead. Keaton pushed them ahead of him, constantly turning to fire at their pursuers. When they reached a bend in the ravine, he pulled them into a narrow crevice in the rock wall. "Stay here," he whispered, checking how many bullets he had left. "I'll lead them away." "No," Lillian grabbed his arm. "We stay together." The little girl whimpered and Lillian pulled her close, stroking her hair. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "Sarah," the child whispered. "Sarah Miller. Those men hurt my papa." Lillian exchanged a glance with Keaton, whose expression softened as he looked at the child. He knelt down to Sarah's level. "We're going to get you somewhere safe, Sarah," he promised. "But we need to be very quiet now." "Can you do that?" Sarah nodded solemnly, her small hand gripping Lillian's tightly. Keaton listened for a moment, then peered around the edge of their hiding place. "I think they've split up to search the ravine," he whispered. "We need to move before they find us. There's a series of caves about half a mile up this wash. If we can reach them, we can hold out until dark." With Sarah between them, they moved as quietly as possible up the ravine, freezing at every sound. Twice they had to hide as bandits passed nearby, and once Keaton silently dispatched a man who came too close, covering the child's eyes as he did so. By the time they reached the caves, the sun was high overhead, beating down mercilessly. They slipped into the cool darkness of the smallest cave, moving deep enough that they couldn't be seen from the entrance. "What now?" Lillian asked as they settled against the rock wall, Sarah curled up against her side. "We wait," Keaton replied, checking their remaining ammunition. "They'll probably keep searching until nightfall, then set up camp at the stagecoach. After dark, we'll make our way back to our horse and ride for Willow Creek." Sarah had fallen asleep, exhausted by terror and exertion. Lillian stroked the child's hair, her heart aching for what the little girl had witnessed. "What will happen to her?" she asked softly. Keaton sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "Willow Creek has a church with a minister and his wife. They've taken in orphans before. They'll find her family if she has any left. And if she doesn't, then they'll find her a home." Keaton looked at the sleeping child, his expression unreadable. "Children are resilient. She'll survive this." "Like you survived losing your parents?" Lillian asked gently. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Perhaps with better fortune than I had." They sat in silence for a while, listening for any sounds of pursuit. The cave was small enough that their shoulders touched, and Lillian found herself drawing comfort from Keaton's solid presence. "I never thought I'd say this," she admitted quietly, "but I'm glad my wedding day went awry. If I hadn't run, if you hadn't been there." She looked down at Sarah. "Some things happen for a reason, I suppose." Keaton studied her face in the dim light filtering from the cave entrance. "You know, for someone who claims she can't be a wife, you have a natural way with children." "It's not children I object to," Lillian clarified. "It's the institution of marriage as it exists, the loss of identity, of autonomy. The expectation that I should live only to serve a husband's needs and desires. It doesn't have to be that way, Keaton said. My parents had a true partnership. My father valued my mother's opinions, her intelligence. They made decisions together. Such marriages are rare, Lillian countered. And the law still gives a husband complete control over his wife's property, her body, her very freedom. Keaton didn't argue the point. What will you do in San Francisco? Beyond teaching, I mean. Lillian considered the question. Live on my own terms. Read what I want. Go where I please without seeking permission. Perhaps join the women's suffrage movement. She smiled slightly. Shocking, I know. Not shocking, Keaton replied. Admirable, actually. The West needs more women with backbone, not fewer. His words warmed her in a way she hadn't expected. Before she could respond, a small sound from the cave entrance made them both tense. Keaton motioned for her to stay put as he crept forward. Gun drawn, Lillian held her breath, cradling Sarah protectively. After what seemed an eternity, Keaton returned. False alarm, he said quietly. Just a coyote passing by, but we should keep our voices down. As the afternoon wore on, they shared Keaton's canteen and the few strips of jerky he had in his pocket. Sarah woke briefly, accepted some water and food, then drifted back to sleep, emotionally exhausted. You're good with her, Keaton observed as Lillian tucked her shawl around the sleeping child. I taught school for 3 years, Lillian explained. Children respond to calm and honesty, even in the worst circumstances. As she spoke, their eyes met in the dim light of the cave, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding, of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Lillian felt her cheeks warm and looked away first. We should try to rest while we can, Keaton suggested. It'll be a long night. Lillian nodded, settling back against the cave wall with Sarah's head in her lap. Despite the hard ground and the danger lurking outside, she felt strangely at peace. As she drifted toward sleep, her last conscious thought was that in just 2 days, Keaton Jones had shown her more respect and understanding than Gregory Hollister had in months of courtship. And that realization was as comforting as it was troubling. The sound of rain pattering against the rocks woke Lillian several hours later. Disoriented, she blinked in the near darkness, feeling the weight of Sarah still sleeping against her. Keaton was at the mouth of the cave, watching the steady downpour that had begun while they slept. This might be our lucky break, he said when he noticed she was awake. Rain will wash away our tracks and keep those men close to whatever shelter they've found. Lillian carefully shifted Sarah and moved to join him at the entrance. The afternoon was fading, the stormy sky hastening nightfall. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by a low rumble of thunder. Is it safe to travel in this? She asked, eyeing the increasingly heavy rainfall. Safer than staying here until they find us, Keaton replied. The wash will flood soon. We need to get to higher ground. He returned to where Sarah slept and gently shook her awake. Time to go, little one, he said, his voice softer than Lillian had ever heard it. We're going to play a game, all right? We need to be very quiet and follow the path I choose, like Indians tracking prey. Can you do that? Sarah nodded solemnly, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Like Indians, she repeated. Keaton checked his pistol one last time, then led them out into the rain. The downpour was cold and penetrating, soaking them within minutes as they made their way up out of the wash. The mud made climbing difficult, but Keaton's strong hand was always there when Lillian or Sarah needed help. They moved as quickly as possible while maintaining stealth, keeping to rocky ground when they could to avoid leaving tracks. Sarah was remarkably stoic, never complaining despite the difficult conditions. When they finally reached the ridge where they'd left the horse, Lillian felt a surge of relief which quickly turned to dismay when they found the animal gone. "Someone found him," Keaton muttered, examining the area. "Looks like they took him about an hour ago." "What do we do now?" Lillian asked, pulling Sarah closer as the child shivered in the rain. Keaton thought for a moment, then pointed west. "Willow Creek is about 8 miles that way. Too far to walk tonight, especially with the little one. But there's a line shack about 2 miles from here that belongs to the Circle H Ranch. We can shelter there tonight and continue at first light." With no better options, they set off toward the line shack, Keaton carrying Sarah when her small legs tired. The rain continued unabated, turning the landscape into a treacherous mix of slippery rocks and sucking mud. By the time the small cabin came into view, they were all exhausted and chilled to the bone. The shack was simple but sound: one room with a stone fireplace, a rough bunk, and basic supplies for cowhands working the range. Keaton quickly got a fire going while Lillian helped Sarah out of her wet clothes and wrapped her in a horse blanket from the supplies. "We need to get you dry too," Keaton said, turning to Lillian. "There are some spare clothes in that trunk. They'll be too big, but they're dry." Lillian hesitated, looking around the small space. "Where will you?" "I'll step outside while you change," he said, understanding her concern. "Need to check the surroundings anyway." When he returned, Lillian had changed into an oversized flannel shirt and rolled-up trousers, her wet clothes hanging near the fire to dry. Sarah was already asleep on the bunk, bundled in blankets. "You should join her," Keaton said, removing his wet coat. "Take the bunk, I'll keep watch." "You need rest too," Lillian argued. "We can take turns." Keaton looked like he might protest, but fatigue won out. "All right, I'll wake you in a few hours." Lillian lay down beside Sarah, who instinctively curled against her warmth. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she watched Keaton move about the cabin, checking supplies and occasionally peering out the single window. He'd removed his wet shirt, and the firelight played across the defined muscles of his back and shoulders, highlighting old scars that spoke of a hard life. When he turned and caught her watching, Lillian quickly closed her eyes, embarrassed. But not before she saw the small smile that curved his lips. She must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing she knew, Keaton was gently shaking her shoulder. The fire had burned down to embers, and the rain had stopped, leaving only the occasional drip from the roof to break the silence. "Your turn," he whispered, careful not to wake Sarah. "I've laid out the pistol on the table. Anything approaches, wake me immediately." Lillian nodded, sliding carefully away from Sarah and moving to the chair by the window. Keaton took her place on the bunk, asleep almost instantly. As she watched over her unlikely companions, Lillian found herself contemplating the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she'd been preparing to submit to a loveless marriage for her father's benefit. Now she was a fugitive, involved in a deadly confrontation with bandits, and responsible for an orphan child, all alongside a man who challenged everything she thought she knew about the opposite sex. Keaton Jones was unlike any man she'd ever met. He was capable of violence. Yes, she'd seen that firsthand, but there was a gentleness to him too, evident in the way he spoke to Sarah, in his respect for Lillian's choices and opinions. He didn't treat her as a delicate flower to be protected, but as a capable partner. The realization made her chest tighten with an unfamiliar sensation. She'd been so determined to reject the traditional path laid out for women that she hadn't considered there might be men who didn't want to walk that path, either men who might value a woman for her mind and spirit as much as her domestic abilities. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with pale light, Lillian made herself a promise. Whatever happened when they reached Willow Creek, she would remember these days. She would remember that there were good men in the world, Men like Keaton Jones, who understood that a woman's worth wasn't measured by her willingness to be a wife. And perhaps, someday, she might find a way to be with such a man without sacrificing the freedom she cherished. The morning brought clear skies and renewed determination. They set out at first light, Keaton carrying Sarah on his shoulders for much of the journey. The child had taken to him completely, chattering about her life before the stagecoach attack and asking endless questions about his gun, his hat, and whether he was a real cowboy. "Real enough, I suppose," he answered with more patience than Lillian would have expected. "Though these days I'm more of a ranch hand than a cowboy. My papa said cowboys are wild," Sarah informed him seriously. "Said they drink whiskey and get in fights." Keaton chuckled. "Some do, that's true, but most are just working men trying to make a living. Are you wild?" Sarah asked, innocent curiosity in her voice. Keaton glanced at Lillian, a spark of humor in his eyes. "What do you think, Miss Vaughn? Am I wild?" Lillian felt a blush creep into her cheeks. "I think Mr. Jones contains multitudes, Sarah. He can be fierce when needed and gentle when appropriate." "That's a diplomatic answer," Keaton said with a smile that made Lillian's heart beat a little faster. They reached the outskirts of Willow Creek by mid-morning. The town was larger than Lillian had expected. Several streets of wooden buildings, a church with a white steeple, a hotel, and the usual assortment of saloons and stores that made up frontier settlements. "We should go directly to the sheriff's office," Keaton said as they paused on a hilltop overlooking the town. "Report what happened with the stagecoach and get Sarah to safety. Then we need to find you that stage to Denver." Lillian nodded, though the thought of continuing her journey alone suddenly seemed less appealing than it had days ago. "You think the Blackwater gang will come here looking for us?" "Possibly," Keaton admitted. "But they typically avoid towns with active law enforcement, too many witnesses." As they approached the main street, Lillian became acutely aware of their appearance. Keaton with his unshaven face and trail-worn clothes, herself in an ill-fitting man's shirt and trousers, and Sarah in her dirty, torn dress. They drew curious stares from townsfolk as they made their way to the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a weathered man in his 50s named Harlan Mills, listened gravely to their account of the stagecoach attack. He sent deputies to investigate and summoned the minister and his wife to care for Sarah. The child clung to Lillian when it came time to say goodbye. "Will you come visit me?" Sarah asked, tears welling in her blue eyes. Lillian knelt to embrace her. "I wish I could, sweetheart, but I have to continue my journey. Mrs. Peterson will take good care of you until they can find your family." "What if they don't find anyone?" Sarah whispered. "Then they'll find you a loving home," Lillian assured her, though her heart ached at the thought of this sweet child facing more uncertainty. After Sarah left with the minister's wife, Sheriff Mills focused on Lillian's situation. "Your father's been offering a substantial reward for your return, Miss Vaughn. Telegrams have gone out to every town in the territory." Lillian's stomach clenched. "I'm 22 years old, Sheriff, legally an adult. My father has no right to drag me back to a marriage I don't want." "Can't say I disagree with you there," the sheriff replied, "but money talks, and Gregory Hollister has many friends in high places." "Is there a stage to Denver today?" Keaton interjected. "Tomorrow morning," Mills answered. "The attack on today's eastbound stage means schedules are disrupted. You folks should get some rest at the hotel. I'll keep an eye out for trouble." As they left the sheriff's office, Keaton placed a gentle hand on Lillian's back, guiding her toward the hotel. "One more night, then you'll be on your way to San Francisco and a new life." Lillian nodded, unable to articulate the conflicting emotions swirling within her. The clerk at the hotel barely concealed his disapproval as Keaton requested 2 separate rooms, but handed over the keys without comment. "Get some rest," Keaton said as they stood in the hallway between their rooms. "I'll check on Sarah later and bring back some proper clothes for you. The general store should have something suitable." "Thank you," Lillian said, suddenly awkward, "for everything." Keaton tipped his hat, that small smile playing at his lips again. "My pleasure, Miss Vaughn." Alone in her room, Lillian luxuriated in a proper bath, scrubbing away days of dust and anxiety. As she soaked in the warm water, her thoughts kept returning to Keaton. Tomorrow she would board a stage to Denver and he would. What? Continue his solitary existence. Head to Montana as he'd mentioned. The thought left an emptiness in her chest that she couldn't explain or perhaps didn't want to examine too closely. A knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Wrapping herself in a towel, she called out, "Who is it?" "It's me," Keaton's voice responded. "I've brought some clothes and news." Lillian secured the towel more firmly and cracked the door open. Keaton stood in the hallway, freshly shaven and wearing a clean shirt, a bundle of fabric in his arms. The transformation was striking. Without several days' worth of stubble and trail dust, he was even more handsome than she'd realized. "I'll just," he said, clearing his throat and holding out the bundle, his eyes carefully averted. "Thank you," Lillian replied, taking the clothes. "What news?" Keaton's expression grew serious. "Your father's men are in town. 3 of them arrived an hour ago, asking questions at the saloon. And there's a telegram from Hollister offering $500 for your return." Lillian's heart sank. "The stage doesn't leave until morning." "No, it doesn't," Keaton agreed. "But there's a freight wagon heading to Junction City tonight. The driver's a friend of Sheriff Mills. He's willing to take you as far as the junction where you can catch the train directly. You'll bypass Denver altogether." "Tonight?" Lillian asked, both relieved and strangely disappointed. "What time?" 9 o'clock. "We'll slip out the back of the hotel and meet him at the livery stable." Keaton hesitated. "I'll escort you to Junction City. Make sure you get on that train safely." Lillian felt a surge of gratitude and something more, something warm and unfamiliar that spread through her chest. "Thank you." Again. Keaton nodded, his blue eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Get dressed and come down for some food. We've got a few hours and you'll need your strength for the journey." After he left, Lillian examined the clothes he'd brought: a simple but well-made blue dress, appropriate undergarments, and a warm shawl. How he'd known her size, she couldn't guess, but everything fit reasonably well. The thought of him selecting these items for her brought another blush to her cheeks. The hotel dining room was nearly empty when she descended the stairs. Keaton rose from a corner table as she approached, pulling out a chair for her with an innate courtesy that belied his rugged appearance. "You clean up well, Mr. Jones," Lillian remarked as they sat down. "As do you, Miss Vaughn," he replied, his eyes appreciative but respectful. "Though I must say, you looked rather fetching in those oversized trousers as well." Lillian laughed, surprising herself with the ease she felt in his presence. "I don't believe anyone has ever described me as fetching while dressed as a ranch hand." "Then they weren't paying proper attention," Keaton said simply. They shared a meal of beef stew and fresh bread, speaking in low voices about the journey ahead. Keaton had already arranged for supplies and had visited Sarah to ensure she was settled comfortably with the minister's family. "She asked about you," he told Lillian. "Wanted to know if you'd found a new dress yet. She was quite concerned about your appearance in men's clothing." "Children notice everything," Lillian said with a smile. "How was she?" "Better than I expected. Mrs. Peterson has a gentle way about her. And they have other children staying with them, so Sarah won't be alone." Keaton hesitated. "Sheriff Mills sent telegrams to settlements along the stagecoach route. If Sarah has family, they'll find them." And if not, then the Petersons will ensure she finds a good home. Keaton reached across the table, briefly covering Lillian's hand with his own. She'll be all right. Children adapt. The simple gesture of his hand on hers sent warmth coursing through Lillian's arm. When he withdrew, she felt its absence keenly. As they finished their meal, Keaton glanced toward the entrance, his expression suddenly alert. "Don't turn around," he said quietly. "Two men just walked in. They match the description of your father's hired guns." Lillian froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "What do we do?" "Finish your bite, then stand slowly and walk toward the kitchen as if you belong here. I'll create a distraction." Keaton's voice was calm, but his eyes were scanning the room, calculating. Lillian did as instructed, forcing herself to chew and swallow before rising casually from her chair. As she moved toward the swinging door that led to the kitchen, she heard raised voices behind her. Keaton confronting a waiter about something in his food, creating just enough commotion to draw all eyes in the room. She slipped through the door and found herself in a busy kitchen. A startled cook looked up from a large pot as she entered. "Excuse me," Lillian said with more confidence than she felt. "Mr. Jones asked me to check on the apple pie he ordered for dessert." The cook looked confused, but pointed to a row of pies cooling on a sideboard. Lillian made a show of examining them, then thanked him and moved toward a back door that, she hoped, led outside. It did. She emerged into an alley behind the hotel just as Keaton appeared around the corner, moving quickly. "They didn't follow," he said, taking her elbow and guiding her deeper into the alley. "But they're definitely looking for you. We need to move up our timeline. The freight wagon leaves in 30 minutes. "My things," Lillian began. "Already taken care of," Keaton assured her. "I moved them to the livery stable earlier, just in case." As they hurried through back alleys toward the edge of town, Lillian was struck again by Keaton's foresight and capability. He'd anticipated problems and prepared accordingly, all while maintaining a calm demeanor that kept her own panic at bay. The livery stable was quiet when they arrived. Most of the town's activity centered around the saloons at this hour. A burly man with a thick gray beard was hitching 2 draft horses to a large wagon loaded with crates and barrels. "Evening, Emmett," Keaton greeted him. "We ready to go?" Emmett looked up, nodding at Keaton before turning his gaze to Lillian. "This the lady Harlan mentioned? The one running from an unwanted wedding?" "Yes," Lillian answered before Keaton could speak. "And I'm very grateful for your assistance, mister." "Just Emmett, madam. No need for formalities." He finished securing the harness. "It ain't a comfortable ride, but it'll get you to Junction City by dawn. Train comes through at 8. Keaton helped Lillian into the back of the wagon, where he'd arranged a small space among the freight. There was a bedroll laid out and a lantern secured to a crate. "You'll be less visible back here," he explained. "I'll ride up front with Emmett. If we're stopped, you stay hidden and quiet." Lillian settled herself as Keaton arranged a tarp to partially conceal her location. Before he pulled it into place, she caught his hand. "I don't know how to thank you properly," she said softly. "You've risked so much for a stranger." Keaton's expression softened as he looked down at her. "You stopped being a stranger somewhere between the ravine and the line shack, Lillian Vaughn." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and hearing it in his deep voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. As the wagon began to move, rattling over the rough street toward the edge of town, Lillian huddled beneath the tarp and contemplated the strange turn her life had taken, and the even stranger feelings developing in her heart for a man she'd known less than a week. Junction City was little more than a dusty outpost centered around the railroad station. When the freight wagon pulled in just after dawn, Keaton helped Lillian down, both of them stiff from the long, bumpy journey. They thanked Emmett, who merely nodded before continuing on to deliver his goods. The train station was a simple wooden structure with a telegraph office attached. A lone clerk sat behind the ticket window, barely glancing up as they entered. "2 tickets to San Francisco," Keaton said, placing money on the counter. Lillian turned to him in surprise. "2. The train makes several stops," he explained. "I'll see you safely to Sacramento at least. From there, the route to San Francisco is more civilized with fewer opportunities for trouble." "But what about your plans? Montana," Keaton shrugged. "Montana's been there a long time." "It'll wait a few more days." The clerk slid 2 tickets across the counter. "Train arrives in 40 minutes. Departing passengers can wait on the platform." Outside, the early morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty street. A small cafe across from the station was just opening, the smell of coffee and frying bacon wafting toward them. "Hungry?" Keaton asked, nodding toward the cafe. Lillian nodded, suddenly aware of how little she'd eaten the night before. They found a table by the window, where they could watch for the train while enjoying a hot meal. As they waited for their food, Lillian studied Keaton across the table. In the clear morning light, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, testament to years spent in the sun. There was a small scar near his left eyebrow that she hadn't noticed before, and his hands, though clean, bore the calluses of hard work. "You're staring," he observed mildly. Lillian didn't look away. "I'm trying to understand you." "What's to understand? Why you're doing all this? Why you care what happens to me?" Keaton was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "When I first saw you running across that field, I thought you were just another damsel in distress. The kind of woman who needs saving but never learns to save herself." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I was wrong. You're stubborn, capable, and braver than most men I know. You didn't run from danger, you ran toward freedom, even knowing the risks. Then why help me at all if not to play the hero?" A small smile touched his lips. "Maybe I admire your spirit. Or maybe I just couldn't bear the thought of someone like Hollister extinguishing it." Their food arrived, momentarily interrupting the conversation. As they ate, Lillian considered his words. No man had ever spoken to her this way, as if her independence was something to be admired rather than corrected. "What will you do in San Francisco?" Keaton asked after a while. "Beyond finding your aunt, I mean." "Teach, if I can find a position," Lillian replied. "Perhaps write." "I've always had stories in my head." She hesitated. "What about you? Will you always drift from place to place?" "It's what I know," he said simply. "Never seemed much point in settling down without a reason." "And what would constitute a reason?" Keaton's eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them. Before he could answer, the distant whistle of the approaching train broke the moment. "That's our cue," he said, placing money on the table and rising. "Let's get your bags." The platform was beginning to fill with other passengers as they took their places. Lillian felt a strange sense of anticipation mixed with dread. In a few days, she would reach San Francisco and begin her new life, the independent existence she'd always wanted. Yet the thought brought less joy than she'd expected. As the train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and billowing steam, Keaton placed a hand lightly on the small of her back. "Ready," Lillian nodded, though in truth, she wasn't sure what she was ready for anymore. Her carefully laid plans suddenly seemed hollow, lacking something essential that she couldn't quite name. They found seats in a passenger car that was only half full. As the train lurched into motion, Lillian watched the small town recede through the window, another place she would likely never see again. Her life had become a series of departures, each one taking her further from her past, but not necessarily closer to the future she envisioned. Keaton sat beside her, his tall frame somewhat cramped in the narrow seat. He seemed content with silence, giving her space with her thoughts. It was another thing she appreciated about him. He didn't feel the need to fill every moment with conversation. The train picked up speed, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails creating a hypnotic backdrop. Plains gave way to rolling hills as they headed west, the landscape changing subtly with each mile. "Tell me about your aunt," Keaton said after a while. "The one in San Francisco." "Aunt Margaret," Lillian replied, grateful for the distraction. "My mother's sister. She left Missouri when I was 10 after her husband died. She wrote that she'd found work as a seamstress for a theater company. Her letters were full of excitement about the city, the freedom she found there." "When did you last hear from her?" Lillian hesitated. 3 years ago. Her letters stopped rather suddenly." "I wrote several times but received no reply," Keaton frowned. "And you're certain she's still there, still alive?" "No," Lillian admitted, "but her last known address is all I have." "It's a starting point, at least." Concern shadowed Keaton's features. "San Francisco is a big city, Lillian, dangerous in its own way, especially for a woman alone with limited resources." "I'm aware of the risks," she said, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. "But what alternative do I have?" "Return to my father, marry Hollister?" "No," Keaton said quickly. "That's not what I meant, I just—" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I worry about what awaits you there, that's all." The simple admission touched Lillian deeply. How strange that this man she'd known for such a short time should care more for her welfare than her own father ever had. "I'll be careful," she promised. "And I'm not without skills. I can teach, so keep accounts. I'll find my way." Keaton nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "I have no doubt of that." As the day wore on, they fell into easy conversation, sharing stories of their pasts and observations about their fellow passengers. When Lillian stifled a yawn, Keaton insisted she rest her head against his shoulder. Despite her initial reluctance, the steady rhythm of the train and the warmth of his presence soon lulled her to sleep. She dreamed of wide open spaces and a small cabin by a stream, of children's laughter, and a man with kind blue eyes who looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When she woke hours later, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "We'll reach Graniteville soon," Keaton said when he noticed she was awake. "The train stops there for the night. We can find rooms at the hotel and continue in the morning." Lillian nodded, still disoriented from her dream and acutely aware that she'd been sleeping against Keaton's chest, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. She straightened, smoothing her hair self-consciously. "I apologize," she said. "I didn't mean to use you as a pillow." "I didn't mind," Keaton replied with that small smile that was becoming increasingly dear to her. Graniteville proved to be larger than Junction City, a proper town with several streets of businesses catering to travelers and the local mining industry. The hotel across from the station was clean and respectable, if not luxurious. As they checked in, the clerk, a thin man with spectacles perched on a narrow nose, looked between them with a questioning expression. "2 rooms," Keaton specified before the man could ask. They dined in the hotel restaurant, both too tired for conversation beyond the practical details of the next day's journey. When they reached the hallway between their rooms, Keaton paused. "Sleep well," he said. "We'll have another long day tomorrow." Lillian nodded, suddenly reluctant to part from him. "Keaton." "Yes, thank you, not just for the rescue and the escort, but for understanding, for seeing me as I am, not as someone to be molded into a proper wife." Keaton's expression softened. "Lillian, any man worthy of you would never want to change who you are. Your spirit, your determination, they're not flaws to be corrected, they're what make you." He trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. "What?" she prompted, heart beating faster. "Extraordinary," he finished quietly. The word hung between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. After a moment, Keaton cleared his throat. "Good night, Lillian," he said, turning toward his door. "Good night," she replied, watching him go with a curious ache in her chest. Alone in her room, Lillian sat by the window, gazing at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. Her thoughts were a tumultuous mix of past and future, of fears and hopes, and newly awakened feelings she'd never expected to experience. For years, she'd been so certain of what she didn't want: a traditional marriage, a life confined by society's narrow definition of womanhood. But what did she want? Freedom, yes. Independence. The ability to make her own choices. But was that enough? Was a solitary existence in a city where she knew no one, where her only potential contact might no longer even be alive, truly the dream she'd been fighting for? And then there was Keaton. A man unlike any she'd known, one who valued her strength rather than seeing it as a threat, who protected without possessing, who offered help without demanding submission in return. A man who made her wonder if perhaps there was a middle path she hadn't considered, a way to be true to herself while also sharing her life with someone who understood her heart. Sleep eluded her as these thoughts circled endlessly. When dawn finally broke, Lillian had reached no conclusions, but she dressed with particular care, suddenly conscious of her appearance in a way she hadn't been before. Keaton was already in the hotel lobby when she descended the stairs, his expression brightening visibly when he saw her. That simple reaction sent a warm flutter through her stomach. "Good morning," he greeted her. "Sleep well?" "Well enough," she lied. "And you?" "Just fine," he replied, though the shadows beneath his eyes suggested otherwise. They had a quick breakfast before returning to the station, where the train was being prepared for departure. As they settled into their seats, Lillian found herself hyper-aware of Keaton beside her, the clean scent of his shaving soap, the way his sleeve brushed against hers when he shifted position, the deep timbre of his voice as he commented on the scenery. The landscape changed dramatically as they continued west, the plains giving way to foothills and then mountains. Tunnels and trestles marked their passage through the Sierra Nevada, the train winding its way through spectacular vistas of pine forests and rocky cliffs. "It's beautiful," Lillian remarked as they emerged from a tunnel to a panoramic view of a mountain lake far below. "I've never seen anything like it." "The West has a way of making a person feel small," Keaton said, gazing out the window. "Reminds you that your troubles are just a tiny part of something much larger." "Is that why you've stayed?" "Because of the landscape," Keaton considered the question. "Partly. But it's more the freedom, I think. Out here a person can reinvent themselves." "Your past doesn't define you the way it does back east." "Yet you carry your past with you," Lillian observed. "Your sister. The things that happened to her." "Some things you never outrun," he acknowledged. "But you learn to live alongside them, to let them shape you without controlling you." His words resonated deeply with Lillian. Wasn't that what she was trying to do, escape her past without being forever defined by it? As the day wore on, the train began its descent from the mountains, entering the Sacramento Valley with its orchards and farmlands. They were drawing closer to their destination, and Lillian felt a growing anxiety that had little to do with her uncertain future in San Francisco, and everything to do with the man beside her. When the conductor announced they would reach Sacramento within the hour, Keaton turned to her with an uncharacteristically serious expression. "Lillian, before we arrive, there's something I need to say." Her heart quickened. "Yes." Keaton hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "These past days have been unexpected. I set out to help a stranger in trouble, but somewhere along the way you became much more than that to me." Lillian held her breath, afraid to hope yet unable to stop herself. "I understand your desire for independence," he continued. "I respect it. But I wonder if you might consider an alternative to facing San Francisco alone." He took a deep breath. "Come with me to Montana. Not as my wife, I know that's not what you want, but as my companion. We could build something together, a life that honors both our needs for freedom and whatever this is between us." The train whistle blew, announcing their approach to Sacramento, but Lillian barely heard it. She stared at Keaton, stunned by his proposal and the emotions it evoked within her. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "This is so unexpected." "You don't need to answer now," Keaton said quickly. "Take time to think. I'll stay in Sacramento while you search for your aunt in San Francisco. If you find her and wish to remain, I'll respect your decision. But if not, or if you simply choose another path, I'll be waiting." The train began to slow as it approached the station, the brakes squealing against the wheels. Around them, passengers gathered their belongings, preparing to disembark. "Why?" Lillian asked, needing to understand. "Why would you offer this?" Keaton's eyes held hers, blue and steady and utterly sincere. "Because in all my years of wandering, I've never met anyone who made me want to stop. Until now." The simple truth of his words left Lillian speechless. As the train lurched to a final stop, passengers began moving toward the exits, breaking the moment between them. "Think about it," Keaton said, standing to retrieve their bags from the overhead rack. "That's all I ask." Sacramento Station was a bustle of activity, passengers disembarking, others boarding, porters calling out, reunion embraces between loved ones. Amid the chaos, Lillian felt strangely detached, her mind still processing Keaton's unexpected proposition. They made their way to the ticket counter, where Keaton purchased a ticket for the morning train to San Francisco. "The Hotel Capitol is just 2 blocks from here," he said as they exited the station. "We can get rooms there for the night." Lillian nodded, still distracted. As they walked through Sacramento's busy streets, she tried to order her thoughts. Keaton had offered her exactly what she'd always claimed to want: a relationship without the constraints of traditional marriage, a partnership of equals. Yet something held her back from immediately accepting. The hotel was a handsome 3-story building with a wide veranda across the front. Inside, the lobby gleamed with polished wood and brass fixtures. Keaton arranged for their rooms while Lillian waited, observing the well-dressed patrons moving through the space. This was civilization of a sort she hadn't seen since leaving St. Louis, a reminder that she was entering a different world from the frontier towns and isolated cabins of the past week. Their rooms were adjacent on the 2nd floor, considerably more luxurious than the accommodations in Graniteville. A brass bed with a plush mattress dominated Lillian's room, alongside a washstand with a porcelain basin and a small writing desk by the window. "We should eat," Keaton suggested after they'd had time to freshen up. "The hotel dining room is supposed to be excellent." Over dinner, they discussed practical matters: the train schedule to San Francisco, Lillian's plans for locating her aunt, where Keaton would stay in Sacramento. Neither mentioned his proposal, though it hung between them like an unacknowledged presence at the table. After the meal, they walked out onto the hotel's veranda to enjoy the mild evening air. The street before them was lit with gas lamps, casting pools of golden light at regular intervals. Carriages rolled past, their wheels making a pleasant rumbling sound against the cobblestones. "It's hard to believe this is the same territory as Willow Creek," Lillian remarked. "They seem worlds apart." "The West is full of contrasts," Keaton agreed. "Civilization and wilderness existing side by side, sometimes within miles of each other. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the street life. When Lillian shivered slightly in the evening breeze, Keaton instinctively placed his coat around her shoulders. The gesture was simple but intimate, his hands lingering briefly at her collar. "Keaton," Lillian began, gathering her courage. "About what you said on the train, you don't need to respond yet," he interrupted gently. "I meant what I said about taking time. I know, but I want to explain something." Lillian turned to face him fully. "All my life, I've defined myself by what I didn't want: my father's control, a conventional marriage, the life my mother led. I never really stopped to consider what I did want, beyond some vague notion of independence." Keaton listened attentively, his expression encouraging her to continue. "These past days with you have shown me something I didn't expect: that there might be a way to have both independence and connection." She chose the word carefully. "But I'm afraid, Keaton. Afraid that what feels right in this moment of danger and excitement might not last once life becomes ordinary again." "There's nothing ordinary about you, Lillian Vaughn," Keaton said softly. "And I don't think there would be anything ordinary about a life shared with you, whether you called yourself my wife or simply my partner." His words warmed her, but the doubt remained. "I need to find my aunt first," she said. "I need to know if she's safe, if she's built the life she described in her letters. And I need to be certain of my own mind before I make any decisions that affect both our futures." Keaton nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That seems wise." Without conscious thought, Lillian reached up and placed her palm against his cheek. Keaton remained perfectly still, though she felt a slight tremor pass through him at her touch. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for seeing possibilities I couldn't see." Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Keaton leaned down until his lips were just inches from hers. "May I?" he asked, his voice barely audible. In answer, Lillian closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was gentle at first, then increasingly urgent as years of denied emotion found release. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, while her hands moved to his shoulders, feeling the solid strength beneath his shirt. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Keaton rested his forehead against hers. "I'll wait for your answer," he promised, "however long it takes." The morning came too quickly. Lillian dressed with care in the blue dress Keaton had purchased for her in Willow Creek, pinning her hair in a simple but elegant style that reflected the more sophisticated environment of the city. When she joined Keaton for breakfast, his appreciative glance made her cheeks warm. "You look beautiful," he said simply. The train to San Francisco was scheduled to depart at 9 o'clock. They walked to the station together, their conversation light but underlaid with the weight of impending separation. On the platform, surrounded by other travelers, they faced each other awkwardly. "I've written down where I'll be staying," Keaton said, handing her a folded piece of paper. "The Hamilton House on J Street. I'll wait 1 week if I don't hear from you by then." He left the sentence unfinished. "I'll send word, whatever I decide," Lillian promised, tucking the paper into her reticule. The train whistle blew, announcing the final boarding call. Impulsively, Lillian stepped forward and embraced Keaton, inhaling his now familiar scent one last time. "Be safe," he murmured against her hair. "You too," she replied, reluctantly pulling away. With a final glance, Lillian boarded the train, finding a window seat that allowed her to see Keaton still standing on the platform. As the train lurched into motion, she raised her hand in farewell, watching his figure grow smaller until the track curved and he disappeared from view. The journey to San Francisco took several hours. during which Lillian alternated between anxiety about what awaited her and thoughts of Keaton's proposal. By the time the train pulled into the bustling station, she had reached no firm conclusions, only a determination to find her aunt before making any decisions. San Francisco was overwhelming after the relative quiet of the territories she'd traveled through. The city sprawled across hills overlooking the bay, a maze of streets filled with carriages, wagons, and people of every description. The air smelled of salt and fish and coal smoke, punctuated occasionally by the mournful cry of foghorns from the harbor. Lillian took a hired cab to the address she had for her aunt, a modest boarding house in a neighborhood that had clearly seen better days. The landlady, a harried-looking woman with graying hair escaping from a severe bun, answered her knock. "Margaret Vaughn." The woman repeated when Lillian inquired. "Yes, she lived here some years back. Left about 2 years ago, owing a month's rent." Lillian's heart sank. "Do you know where she went?" The landlady shrugged. "Heard she got work at one of the theaters on Market Street. That's all I know." With this meager information, Lillian began a systematic search of the theaters in the area. By nightfall, she was exhausted, discouraged, and no closer to finding her aunt. She took a room at a respectable women's boarding house, collapsing onto the narrow bed with a sense of increasing unease about her situation. The next 3 days followed a similar pattern, searching theaters, costume shops, and seamstress establishments, asking about Margaret Vaughn, meeting blank stares or vague recollections that led nowhere. Her carefully saved money was dwindling rapidly, eaten away by lodging costs, meals, and cab fares. On the 4th day, she finally had a breakthrough. A costume mistress at the Golden Gate Theater remembered Margaret. Talented with a needle she was, the woman recalled. Worked here for almost a year before she married that merchant and moved to Oakland. "Married," Lillian repeated, surprised. "Do you remember his name? Harrison, I think. Or Harris. Something with an H. He owned an import business, had a house in Oakland." This new information led Lillian across the bay to Oakland, where she spent another day inquiring at businesses about a merchant named Harrison or Harris. By evening, she was ready to admit defeat when the proprietor of a small bookshop mentioned that a George Harrison had indeed owned an import business on Webster Street, but had sold it and moved to Portland following his wife's death the previous winter. His wife died. Lillian asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Influenza," the bookshop owner confirmed. "Swept through Oakland last December. Took quite a few, including Mrs. Harrison. George was devastated, sold everything, and headed north within a month." Lillian thanked the man and stepped back onto the street, her mind reeling. Aunt Margaret was gone. The tenuous connection she'd been counting on, the safety net she'd imagined, had vanished as completely as morning fog under a strong sun. She returned to San Francisco in a daze, her thoughts scattered. In her room at the boarding house, she sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life as darkness fell. The piece of paper with Keaton's address felt heavy in her reticule, a tangible reminder of the choice before her. With Margaret gone, Lillian had 2 options: stay in San Francisco and try to build a life alone, or return to Sacramento and accept Keaton's offer of partnership. The first path held the independence she'd always claimed to want, but also isolation and uncertainty. The second offered connection and support, but required trust in a relationship unlike any she'd witnessed growing up. As she considered her choices, Lillian realized something fundamental had shifted within her. The fierce independence she'd clung to for so long had been, in part, a defense against becoming like her mother, trapped and diminished by a controlling husband. But Keaton wasn't her father. He demonstrated time and again that he valued her strength, her opinions, her autonomy. And there was more. In the quiet hours of the night, Lillian finally admitted to herself what she'd been avoiding acknowledging. She'd fallen in love with Keaton Jones. Not the desperate, clinging love of romance novels, but something steadier and deeper, a recognition of a kindred spirit, a person who saw her clearly and valued what he saw. The realization brought both clarity and peace. In the morning, she would return to Sacramento and give Keaton her answer. But first, she needed to write a letter, one that had been forming in her mind throughout her search for her aunt. At the small desk in her room, Lillian dipped a pen in ink and began to write. "Dear Father, by the time you receive this letter, I will be beyond your reach or influence. I want you to know that I harbor no hatred toward you, only sadness for the relationship we might have had if you had seen me as a person rather than a possession to be managed. I will not be returning, nor will I be marrying Gregory Hollister. Instead, I am choosing a different path, one that honors both my independence and my heart. Please do not attempt to find me. Any funds you might spend on such efforts would be better directed towards Sarah Miller, a child orphaned in a stagecoach attack who is now in the care of Reverend Peterson in Willow Creek. She deserves a chance at happiness that my mother never had in your household. I forgive you, Father, and I hope someday you might understand that a woman's worth lies not in her obedience but in her spirit. Your daughter, Lillian." She sealed the letter, addressing it to her father's ranch. Tomorrow she would post it, before boarding the train to Sacramento, her final act of separation from her old life. As dawn broke over San Francisco, Lillian gathered her few belongings and checked out of the boarding house. At the post office, she mailed her letter, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders as she watched it disappear into the mailbag. The train ride back to Sacramento seemed both interminable and 2 brief hours of anticipation and nervous energy as she rehearsed what she would say to Keaton, followed by a sudden arrival that left her momentarily disoriented. The Hamilton house was a modest establishment on a quiet street, neither luxurious nor shabby. Lillian's heart pounded as she approached the front desk, asking for Keaton Jones. "Room 214, the clerk informed her after consulting his register. "Second floor, end of the hall." Lillian climbed the stairs slowly, gathering her courage. At room 214 she hesitated, then knocked firmly. Long seconds passed with no response. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. "He went out about an hour ago, miss," a voice said behind her. Lillian turned to see a maid with an armload of linens. "Said he was heading to the train station to check schedules." "Thank you," Lillian replied, disappointment and relief mingling strangely in her chest. She would have to wait for his return. Rather than linger in the hallway, she decided to wait in the small parlor off the hotel lobby. As she descended the stairs, the front door opened, and Keaton walked in, his tall figure immediately recognizable even from behind. Lillian froze on the stairs, suddenly uncertain. What if he'd changed his mind? What if the connection she'd felt had been merely a product of danger and proximity? As if sensing her presence, Keaton turned, his eyes widening when he saw her. For a breathless moment, they simply stared at each other across the lobby. Then he moved toward her, taking the stairs 2 at a time until he stood before her. "Lillian," he said, her name a question and a statement all at once. "Hello, Keaton," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. They stood awkwardly on the stairs, other guests forced to move around them. Keaton seemed to realize this and gestured toward the parlor. "Can we talk?" Lillian nodded, following him into the small room where, fortunately, they were alone. Keaton remained standing, his hat in his hands, an uncharacteristic uncertainty in his posture. "I didn't expect you back so soon," he said. "Did you find your aunt?" "She died last winter," Lillian replied simply. "Influenza." "I'm sorry," Keaton said, genuine sympathy in his voice. "That must have been difficult news." Lillian nodded, then gathered her courage. "It was. But it also clarified things for me, made me realize what truly matters." Keaton watched her intently, hope and caution warring in his expression. "And what is that connection?" Lillian said, taking a step toward him. "Not the kind that diminishes or constrains, but the kind that strengthens. The kind I've found with you." The tension visibly drained from Keaton's shoulders. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying yes," Lillian confirmed, her voice growing stronger with certainty. "Yes to Montana. Yes to building something together." She took another step closer. "I still can't be a wife, Keaton, not in the traditional sense. I won't surrender my independence or my identity." "I would never ask you to," he assured her, closing the remaining distance between them. "All I want is to be with you, Lillian, to share my life with yours, whatever form that takes." Lillian reached up, placing her hand against his cheek as she had that night on the veranda. "Then let's do exactly that." Keaton's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then brilliant. He set his hat aside and took her hands in his. "I have something to show you," he said. "Something I was planning to send to you in San Francisco if you hadn't returned." From his pocket, he withdrew a folded document and handed it to her. Lillian opened it to find a deed for a parcel of land in Montana Territory. "It's near a small town called Pine Creek," Keaton explained. 300 acres with a creek running through it, good grazing land, some timber. There's a cabin that needs work, but it's solid. Room to build more if we want." "You bought this?" Lillian asked, amazed. "2 years ago with savings from ranch work." "I've never done anything with it, never had a reason to settle there. Until now." Lillian studied the document, trying to imagine the land it represented, their land, potentially. A place they could build together, shaped by both their visions. "It sounds perfect," she said finally, looking up at him with shining eyes. "When can we leave?" Keaton laughed, the sound rich with joy and relief. "The northbound train leaves tomorrow morning. But Lillian, are you certain? This isn't a decision to make lightly." "I've never been more certain of anything," she replied with absolute conviction. "The past week has shown me more about myself and about you than years of careful planning ever could. I know what I want now, Keaton. I want a life where I'm valued for who I am, where I can pursue my own interests while sharing a deeper connection with someone who understands me. I want you." Keaton pulled her into his arms then, his embrace both gentle and fiercely protective. "And I want you, Lillian Vaughn. Not as a possession or an ornament, but as a partner in every sense." When they kissed, it felt like a promise, a pledge between equals to build something neither could create alone. The journey north took them through landscapes of increasing beauty, California's valleys giving way to Oregon's forests, and finally, Montana's sweeping vistas of mountains and prairies. They traveled as companions, sharing a sleeper compartment without concern for convention, their relationship defined by their own understanding rather than society's expectations. Pine Creek proved to be a small but growing settlement nestled at the foot of a mountain range. The local mercantile, saloon, and smithy formed the center of town, with scattered homesteads extending into the surrounding countryside. They were greeted with curious but friendly interest by the townsfolk, who were accustomed to newcomers seeking fresh starts in the territory. When they finally reached their land after a half-day's ride from town, Lillian caught her breath at the sight. The cabin sat on a gentle rise overlooking a valley where a creek wound through meadows dotted with wildflowers. Behind it, pine forests climbed the mountainside, dark green against the blue sky. "It's beautiful," she whispered as Keaton helped her down from the wagon they'd purchased in town. "More than I imagined." "It needs work," Keaton cautioned, though she could see he was pleased by her reaction. The cabin's been empty for years. Inside, the cabin was indeed rough, a single large room with a stone fireplace, its wooden floors dusty and its windows clouded with grime. But Lillian could see the potential immediately. The structure was sound, the location perfect, the space adequate for their initial needs. "We can add rooms as we need them," Keaton said, watching her examine the space. "Maybe a proper bedroom, a study for your writing." "And a wider porch," Lillian added, already envisioning improvements. "Facing the valley, with chairs where we can watch the sunset." They spent that first day cleaning, making the cabin habitable enough for the night. As darkness fell, they sat before a small fire, eating a simple meal and planning their future together. "I've been thinking," Keaton said as they finished eating. "Pine Creek needs a school. The children are being taught by the minister's wife in the church, but she's expecting a baby and won't be able to continue much longer. They've been looking for a teacher." Lillian looked at him in surprise. "You've made inquiries already?" "I mentioned in town that you were a teacher," Keaton admitted. "The storekeeper's wife is on the town council. She seemed very interested." Warmth bloomed in Lillian's chest at his thoughtfulness. "You've been planning all along for me to have my own work." "Of course," Keaton said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I want you to be happy here, Lillian. That means having purpose beyond this cabin and this land." In that moment, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. This man, this partnership, was everything she'd never dared to hope for. The following weeks were filled with hard work as they prepared for winter. Keaton repaired the cabin's roof and added proper glass to the windows while Lillian planted a late kitchen garden and preserved the wild berries that grew abundantly nearby. They purchased a milk cow, some chickens, and a pair of riding horses to complement the draft horses that pulled their wagon. Word of Lillian's teaching experience spread quickly through the small community. Before the first snow fell, she was officially hired as Pine Creek schoolteacher, with classes to be held in the church until a proper schoolhouse could be built in the spring. Their life together developed its own comfortable rhythm. Mornings began with shared coffee by the fire before Keaton went out to work the land or hunt, while Lillian prepared for her teaching or tended to household tasks. Evenings were for conversation, reading aloud from books purchased on their occasional trips to larger settlements, and increasingly, for the physical expression of their deepening bond. Their first winter together brought challenges: heavy snows that isolated them for days, a brief illness that left Keaton feverish and Lillian anxiously tending to him, the constant work required to keep warm and fed in the Montana cold. But it also brought a profound intimacy, a knowledge of each other that went beyond the physical to something deeper and more enduring. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers and the promise of new beginnings. The town gathered for a raising of the schoolhouse, men from miles around coming together to build the simple structure while women prepared a feast to feed the workers. Keaton worked alongside them, his quiet competence earning the respect of their neighbors. As Lillian watched him that day, laughing with the other men as they raised the schoolhouse walls, she felt a swell of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed her. This was love, not the fragile, romanticized version she'd been taught to expect, but something sturdy and practical and infinitely precious. That evening, as they sat on the porch they'd built together, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson, Lillian turned to Keaton with a question that had been forming in her mind for weeks. "What would you think about children?" she asked. "Not immediately, but someday." Keaton's expression softened as he considered her question. "I'd like that," he said simply, "very much, but only if you're certain it's what you want." "I am," Lillian replied. I've been thinking about it since Sarah. About having a family of our own, children we could raise to think for themselves, to value both independence and connection. Keaton took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. We would raise them together as equals, boys who respect women, girls who know their own worth. Yes, Lillian agreed, leaning against his shoulder. Exactly that. They sat in companionable silence as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear. After a while, Keaton spoke again, his voice thoughtful. You know, if we had children, it might be simpler legally if we were married, for inheritance, if nothing else. He turned to face her fully. But I want you to know that I'm not asking for anything to change between us. No matter what legal arrangement we might make, you would always be my equal partner, never my possession. Lillian considered his words carefully. The idea of marriage no longer filled her with the dread it once had. Perhaps because now she understood it could be defined by the people within it, not by society's rigid expectations. Perhaps, she said finally, we could redefine what marriage means at least for us, create our own understanding of it. We could write our own vows, Keaton suggested. Make promises that reflect what we truly believe about partnership. The idea appealed to Lillian. No obedience, she stipulated. Definitely not, Keaton agreed with a smile. Mutual respect instead. And I keep my name, Lillian added, at least professionally for my teaching. Of course. And we make decisions together about the land, about children, about everything that affects us both. Keaton nodded, his expression serious. Always. Lillian turned these conditions over in her mind, searching for any sense of constraint or loss. Finding none, she made her decision. Then yes, she said. I think perhaps I could be a wife after all, but only your wife, and only on these terms. The joy that spread across Keaton's face was answer enough, but he pulled her into his arms anyway, his kiss a deeper affirmation of all they'd discussed. They were married that autumn in a simple ceremony, beside the creek that ran through their land. Reverend Peterson from Willow Creek made the journey to officiate, bringing with him a special guest, Sarah Miller, who had indeed been adopted by the minister and his wife after no family could be located. The 8-year-old served as Lillian's attendant, carrying a bouquet of late wildflowers and beaming with pride at her important role. The small gathering of neighbors and friends from Pine Creek witnessed as Keaton and Lillian exchanged vows. They had written themselves promises of respect, partnership, and unwavering support for each other's dreams and growth. I don't take you as my wife to own or control, Keaton vowed, his voice steady and sure. I take you as my partner in all things, pledging to walk beside you rather than ahead or behind, to value your mind as much as your heart, to cherish your strength rather than seek to diminish it. Lillian's response was equally heartfelt. I choose to be with you not from necessity or convention, but from love freely given and received. I promise to stand with you through all that life brings, to speak my truth and hear yours with an open heart, to build with you a home where both our spirits can thrive. When Reverend Peterson pronounced them husband and wife, Lillian felt none of the dread she'd once associated with those words. Instead, there was only certainty and joy, the knowledge that she had found something rare and precious, a love that enhanced rather than restricted her sense of self. The years that followed brought challenges and triumphs in equal measure. The school in Pine Creek flourished under Lillian's guidance, eventually expanding to include a small library where she taught adult literacy classes in the evenings. Keaton's careful management of their land resulted in a successful small ranch operation, with a reputation for quality that spread throughout the territory. Their family grew with the birth of a daughter, Adelaide Margaret, followed 2 years later by a son they named Thomas. The children thrived in the freedom of the Montana landscape, raised with their parents' shared values of independence, critical thinking, and respect for others. Lillian continued teaching even after the children were born, with Keaton taking equal responsibility for their care, an arrangement that raised eyebrows among some of the more traditional families in the area, but gradually earned respect as others observed their successful partnership. On their 10th anniversary, they sat together on the expanded porch of what was now a comfortable home of several rooms, watching their children play in the meadow below. Adelaide's copper hair, so like her mother's, caught the evening light as she showed her younger brother how to make a whistle from a blade of grass. "You ever regret it?" Keaton asked quietly. "Not going to San Francisco, not having a completely independent life?" Lillian considered the question seriously, as she did all matters between them. "No," she said finally, "because I've never lost my independence. I've simply chosen to share it with you and the children." She took his hand, the gesture as natural as breathing after a decade together. "What about you? Do you ever miss the freedom of drifting from place to place?" Keaton shook his head, his gaze moving from their children to her face. "Not once. Every day I wake up grateful that you ran from that wedding, that I happened to be riding by when you needed help." He smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "That you couldn't be a wife in the traditional sense, but were willing to just be with me instead." "The best decision I ever made," Lillian agreed, leaning against his shoulder as they had countless times over the years. As they watched the sunset paint the sky in familiar glory, Lillian reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from a desperate flight across Colorado territory to this peaceful moment on a Montana porch. She had set out seeking freedom from constraints, never imagining she would find it not in solitude, but in partnership with a man who valued her exactly as she was. "I love you, Keaton Jones," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of their shared history and the promise of all that was yet to come. "And I love you, Lillian Vaughn Jones," he replied, his arm tightening around her shoulders, "today and always." In the meadow below, their children's laughter rose like music on the evening breeze, the sweetest affirmation of a love that had redefined what it meant to be husband and wife, partner and friend. Two independent spirits choosing each day to build a life together.